Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Demonstrating Implementation Excellence stream at SNOMED Expo 2025. I want to thank IQVIA for sponsoring this stream. My name is Anne Randolph Hoyen. I'm an implementation support specialist at SNOMED International, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. We'll address all questions to the presentation at the end. And for our online audience, please use the Q&A button to submit your questions to the presenter. And for those attending in person, feel free to use the microphone that we will give to you or provide it in the room when time comes. And now it's my pleasure to introduce Matthew Cordell from CSIRO, who will be presenting from requesting to results using SNOMED CT within electronic diagnostic requests. So Matthew, over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks everyone for coming. I know it's getting towards the end of the day. And yeah, my name's Matt Cordell. I'm terminology specialist with the CSIRO in Australia. We manage the National Release Centre and also do a lot of support work with HL7 and vendors and general community. There's a QR code here. If you've got your phone handy, feel free to scan that. There's a very minor interactive portion later on. If you don't have your phone, it's not going to matter, and there'll be another chance to scan later on. But I just want to go through the work we've done with a couple of the colleges developing our e-requesting standards and some of the lessons we've learned through that and how we've educated the community and how we've done those collaborations. So I'll get into it because I've got quite a lot to get through, so I apologise if I speed through some things, but we'll see how we go. So I'd like to start with just the context for what we're doing here, because I think that's really important with defining any sort of terminology implementation. And for us, that context is the e-requesting implementation guide that was developed as part of the Spark program. That's a HL7 Fire implementation guide. Within that, we have two profiles, one for pathology and one for radiology. So underneath, they're based on the same sort of thing, but there's some slight differences for each of those different industries' requirements. And that whole program for Spark was a collaboration between the policymakers, so all the government agencies, colleges, clinicians, software vendors, even patients. There was representation of how things should be done. And that's been going for the last couple of years, and I think my colleagues have done plenty of spruiking for that, so I'm sure you've heard about it before. But it was really about having everyone involved, so there was a community buy-in, and then they felt that they had a stake in this. It wasn't some external governance saying this is what you should do. They were saying what they needed to do. But in the terms of what I'm talking about today for terminology, it's this service request.code is the element that's most important for us. There's a lot of other elements that talk about other things, but that service request code is what's being requested. The other thing to start off with for context is this whole pre and post coordination discussion. That was something we had with the colleges about, do they use a single SNOMED code or do they have a post coordinated expression? And I think a lot of that discussion comes from a basis where there's a couple of different factors into it. One was that SNOMED has insufficient coverage. And so they're saying, well, it doesn't have all the codes we need, so we need to post coordinate to get all the content that we want. And then the other side of that is then we could add all the codes, but then there's that fear of combinatorial explosion. If we add in all these codes, we could have every combination. But I think in reality, those concerns, while valid, they're sometimes disproportionately talked about, because when we started this work, the pathology industry for their work, we had 76% coverage off the shelf. So we did have to add some content, but it was still a pretty good coverage for a content area that probably hasn't had much development for many years. And then when you look at frequency data, that coverage actually improves much more. So the college also has a subset of the top 50 most requested tests, and we've got 92% coverage there. And I think you see that with radiology as well, that they might have a catalogue of 2,000, 4,000 tests, but 90% of those tests are covered by 200 procedures. So there's a really long tail of coverage, and there's a value proposition of how much work do you put into getting all this content in when it's only done on 1 or 2 patients a year. It's so esoteric that you're probably not going to get really useful analytics or decision support out of that information. And there's always the option for free text. So if a code's missing, it doesn't stop any request happening, because there's sometimes the doctors want to just ask a different way of representing things. As for the combinatorial explosion, not all combinations are valid. So while you could say we have all the combinations of specimen and component, you could have something that was a cadmium measurement in CSF, but no one's doing that. So we don't need to create all those combinations. So in reality, we're only creating tests when the labs say, well, you're missing it. And we had an initial period, maybe in the first year or so, where we were creating content, but now it's a trickle through of a few codes, and a lot of what we're doing now is genetic testing, which is something that SNOMED doesn't really have a whole lot in there, and it's an evolving industry, so it's very manageable. And then, of course, there's other body sites that you can capture information. So for biopsies, we don't need to have a biopsy procedure for every body site. We can just say it's a core biopsy, and then you can capture that information in something like the body site. The other important thing was, I think there's some misunderstanding about how SNOMED works and some of the technical capacity of the users or the clinicians of expecting how things would happen. And this really came forth with the radiology work, where that they were really keen to have a post-coordinated approach, and that their proposal was essentially a concatenation of codes where it's really important for them. They wanted to identify modalities and body sites and laterality, and whether something was with or without contrast. And talking through them, I think a lot of that was the mindset of search tokens. So if they knew that they had those 3 codes and they say, I want to look for the ultrasound procedures, there was a code they could search for. Whereas when we'll get into some of the later examples, you can do all these things they wanted to with the single code. And there are problems with that post-coordinated approach as well, in that it really limits the specificity that you can do. There's only so many things you can say with 3 codes in those combinations. And it also gets really complicated to implement, and you still get ambiguity. There's certain things that a pre-coordinated code gives you, like you also get your synonyms to help with searching for all those other things. So it really is, even with post-compositional grammar, that single code that represents as much as really useful is the preferable way to go. And finally, before I get into the next section, is it's important to think about approaches to implementation. There's no right or wrong answer for any of these, but we've sort of come up with this matrix, or at least this is how I think of implementation approaches. You've got, on one side, how it appears within software. You can either have a native implementation where you have SNOMED first, where it appears on the interface and everything that's being interacted with is native SNOMED, or a reference implementation where software is designed and SNOMED's used as a reference terminology in the back and everything's mapped to that. And then on the top is the technical approach of how those things are done, whether you're using either RF2 off the shelf or some bespoke solution where you're putting it into a database and creating a whole lot of technical functionality that you need to develop, or terminology services where you're taking a pre-existing product that's designed specifically for terminology services and incorporating that into your system. And as I said, there's no right or wrong way of which of these to do. And I think it comes down to a lot of factors. Each implementation is going to be different, whether it's a greenfields situation. I think the startups, or I should say first, our recommended and preferred approach in Australia is saying that to do a native implementation with terminology services. And the reasons for that is the cost. There's an upfront cost to doing that, especially if you're an existing vendor. You have to re-engineer your whole system sometimes to get that working. But the alternative is there can be a long-term cost where you have a maintenance of mappings and things like that. And then with mappings, if you want bi-directional interoperability, you need to do bi-directional mappings. So each of these things needs to be considered around what the costs are, what your system does. If you're only sending and not receiving, maybe you don't need that bi-directional interoperability. And the terminology services, you get a lot of things off the shelf. You get value sets, ECL, more customized search instead of some of the legacy search systems we've seen where they just have starts with. And so because of that, uses a condition to search and behave in a very specific manner. And so having set some context around how we approach it, all the considerations of why we make certain decisions, we'll get into how we built the value sets and the challenges and lessons learned along the way there. So both of the value sets we've developed for radiology and pathology were done in collaboration with the colleges. The RCPA, our pathology college, they started this work over 10 years ago. That the pathology college has quite a invested interest in health informatics. And so they predated Spark. They've been doing this for a while. And they have regular working groups where specialties meet together. The labs bring their tests and say, well, we're going to try and add 10 more tests to the catalogue. They'll discuss them, work out, they do the mappings themselves, work out which SNOMED code's appropriate, and they add that to the value set. If they find that there's gaps missing, they get in contact with the NRC and they request those. And we have a pretty good relationship there where they can contact us, they'll give us a list. If we need clarification, we can talk to them. They might go back to the specialists. And now they're up to a catalogue of 1,900 procedures. So it's, I think, fairly sizable now, and it's just that trickle of genetic tests now. And I think with that 1,900 tests, we're probably at about 95% coverage, and we're really into that long tail now and just addressing it as it's required. The Radiology College, RANSCA, that's a lot more recent development. That started just over 2 years ago, so that work kicked off just before Spark did, and then it just quickly was absorbed as part of that process, because I think when they started their project, there wasn't really a clear use case, but Spark provided that we needed a value set for the service request for radiology. Their approach was a bit different, where they've started off with plans to create a very standardized RRS catalogue, agnostic of SNOMED, where they compiled all the tests that they need. It was a little bit like looking at all of the existing catalogues around there, but at the same time, I think it was more taking an approach of, we want all these modalities and we'll think of all the combinations. So they sort of front, post-coordinated, and then mapped to it. We ended up, at the end of that 2 years, that RRS catalogue they've come up with is just under 2,500 procedures. And about 48% of those had an equivalent mapping in SNOMED. So the coverage wasn't great, and we're in the process of addressing that coverage, but we're also aware that there's a lot of other countries doing that work. So we're trying to leverage that rather than create a heap of content that then we're going to duplicate with other countries. But then when we looked at an actual implementation, so we talked to one of the hospitals that we work with. They've got some frequency data. And again, I think that's really useful to say, well, their catalogue had 1,500 tests at this hospital, which is smaller than the RRS. And if we just looked at the 90% by volume, that was less than 250 tests. So it was pretty trivial activity to map that. It only took a few days or a week or so. And that we had 70% coverage. So you can see that coverage is much better when you look at frequency data. Again, we've still got gaps, but that initial 48% is a bit misleading of how much content may or may not be missing. And that's also some of the design decisions in the RS, where they've got every combination of left, right, bilateral, and absent. So it conflates the numbers a little bit. Into the challenges, I think most of my next slides coming up are all about variations in language. And I don't have answers here. This is just saying the challenges we found and the discussions we've had with them. So the thighs and the femurs were a big one. Sometimes in the catalogue, so the RRS that they've come up with, the mapping, they've just had one code for X-ray of the femur, and that maps to that code. But you can see there's also a plain they'd X-ray of the femur, and they've mapped it to X-ray of the thigh. But there's also a plain X-ray of the femur. And if you think about an X-ray, you can't get the femur without including the thigh. They're all one and the same sort of thing. And then MRIs, their catalogue, they've had MRI of the thigh and femur. And you can see we've got both those options there. And we've just gone with the college's advice, because through talking with them, that slight nuance, although procedurally it might be the same in a clinic, it does give you a bit of implicit intent where, particularly the MRI, they've got the two because it might suggest whether it's a soft tissue injury or a bone injury, even though it's still an MRI of the upper leg. This one was an interesting challenge too when we looked at another hospital catalogue that was going to adopt or looking to adopt the value set. The language used is really inconsistent and it's specific. It's not ambiguous, but it's variable. So the college catalogue, they had this term MRI of the brain and cervical cord, and they've mapped that to this SNOMED code MRI of the brain and cervical cord. So that's a good equivalent mapping there. There's also these two concepts which weren't in their value set, but they are in SNOMED, of an MRI of the head and neck and MRI of head and spine. And then we looked at the hospital that was going to implement. They had these three codes, which didn't quite map to any of the ones the rest of us had come up with. They've got just that difference of having spine and cervical or spinal cord. They're unambiguous as well, but they're that bit more specificity that we're sort of in these discussions now of which codes do we pick here. And ultimately, my feeling is that they're all MRIs of the head and neck, and you get the brain and the spine cord and all those things with it. They're just sort of, I think, suggesting how much detail they'll look into. Maybe the only one that's a little bit different is this one where it's looking at the whole spine. But yeah, these are just language variations that we're having to deal with. And it's not exclusive to radiology. The pathologists also have this. We've got these 4 tests here in the pathology catalogue. And in reality, if you order any of those tests, you're going to get this one thing, because I think the labs will treat all of those the same, because that blood glucose is almost a synonym for saying, well, it's a blood glucose, but in the lab, they actually spin it down and you get serum or plasma. Most of the time it's serum, but a few analytes it matters whether it's serum or plasma. For glucose, it doesn't. And then our random glucose, anything that's not fasting is random. So these 4 tests are arguably the same. You could say it might be whole blood, but we've also got a code for a glucometer blood glucose. So that's a blood glucose as well, but it's actually off like a finger prick. Clinician feedback. So one of the vendors that was looking to adopt this, and I think this was the same one that came back with the, or that we had the catalogue for the different MRIs of head and neck spine cords. This, I won't read through this, but it throws back to those initial concerns people had about the language and how it's used. And their concern was, I guess, the aesthetics of it, that the terms were a bit variable. Sometimes MRI was at the front, sometimes it was at the end. And so that's definitely a task on us to review our preferred terms and just make that look. If we're encouraging people to adopt SNOMED natively, we want to make sure that it's interface ready. But a lot of those concerns are also just the way that people work, where the clinicians will type in modality first, then type in a body site, and then maybe lateralize it at the end. And one of the comments here was they didn't like that it said MRI of left knee. They prefer MRI knee left. And it's kind of a less natural language, but that was just how their search filters work. And I think because a lot of their reviews happen in Excel spreadsheets, that's how they think of it. Whereas in an actual system, that's not how it works. And that's where we get to doing some actual demonstrations to show people how it should be used. Open world, closed world conflict. I'll quickly go through this because I'm running out of time here. But there is, like, radiology is typically ordered unspecified. They'll say just MRI of the brain, and well, that's how it's requested, and it's up to the radiologist to make a decision of whether with or without contrast is applicable. There could be contexts where you might want to explicitly order without contrast if there's maybe a past history of sensitivities, but you could argue that if it's that clinical safety concern, it should be in its own dedicated element to say that they've had a history of reactions to contrast media. Some of the language again here, SNOMED International, they've done some work to make the terms a lot more explicit about what's being talked about. So we can see back in 2020, our terms looked like this, and now, I think in 2021, they were tidied up to be clear that these all used contrast material. They kept the codes, which is really good. It meant that none of the mappings or implementations break. But you could argue it's really important to say that with contrast there if you're doing logic against the modeling. But we probably don't need to say it because you can't do a CT angiography without contrast. It's always implicit. It just gives that suggestion, though, that which levels of specificity do we have? But these are things that we just sort of need to look at the whole catalogue and talk to the radiologist and say, well, does this make sense? And just general consistency issues, which we encounter a lot in general content with things like, here we've got 2 MRI procedures. The ankle, we don't have a without contrast variant for that one, but we do for the kidneys. There's no lateralized kidney without contrast, but there's lateralized kidney with contrast. And just the little things like plurals, that parrot concept here of MRI of kidneys, that suggests that it's a bilateral procedure, but you can see that as we go down, we don't get bilateral till we go through the left and right. And finally, we've developed a collection of demonstrators and examples to sort of help show vendors and clinicians how they should be interacting with SNOMED in their systems or what they can expect. These aren't the only way to do it, but it shows you that it's not about looking through spreadsheets. Again, if you've got, I'll leave that for a second. This will just load up a web app that you can then scan later on. And as part of our Connectathons, we developed a series of apps, and it's a patient viewer. So when we get to it, and if you don't, you're not missing out on a lot. It's only a few seconds. So the first thing I'll start with is smart forms. So this will just run along while I'm talking here, but smart forms, if you're not familiar, is a FHIR specification. It's a combination of structured data capture and smart app launch. This lets you do really a consistent way of saying how you want the data captured, but it lets you not just define an interface, you can do some complex conditional logic, specify the terminology bindings and do calculations. So you could have a data entry for a height and weight and calculate BMIs. And the idea with a smart app is that you can define one of these, and any vendor that's capable should be able to drop that into their system. And we've got links through this. I think you can look at the slides afterwards and click through. There's playgrounds and examples for all of these things. Our SNOMED UI demonstrator. So some of you might have seen this before. This is the UI demonstrator from SNOMED International. We've extended it just to do this demonstration for radiology. So it starts off here with just that pretext search. We search for X-ray of the skull. We can pick a test, and you can see that you're able to extract this other information. This isn't really how a clinical system would work, but it's just showing you that you can access all this other information. Another approach would be if you wanted to do a post-coordinated approach and search for one bit at a time. So we'll start with searching for an ankle structure, and it filters. Then our modalities, we'll do an MRI, and you can see that filters a bit more. We can choose that, but we can also put a lateralized code, and now we're just left with left ankle MRI. So you can see that list of pre-coordinated codes can still be accessed by a post-coordinated approach. And finally, this is our demo from the Connectathons we've developed. So here we've got a system, I'll just pause that for a sec, where it's simulating a clinical interface, and you can type in a clinical note and it will provide some suggestions there. And as I was talking, it came up with a few, and I think it does another one here. They can select that code, and you can put in some logic there to say, and these are made up, this isn't part of SNOMED, you code this logic into your system, but suggest a few tests. And you don't need to code, because of SNOMED, you can leverage the ECL, so you don't have to code all the possible findings. You can just say, if they select anything to do with fatigue, we suggest you do a serum iron, a TSH, a full blood count, and a HbA1c. Whatever, they could be rules that the college might define, but they don't have to be complex. You can leverage those anchor points within the terminology, so it's a simple subtypes of this concept. Oh, there was another example there. Similarly, you can do things. So in this example, we're going to order some radiology. We'll pick a chest X-ray, a mammography, and a CT of the breast. And as soon as we've done that, you can see we've got some warnings popped up here. Again, this is just leveraging that terminology hierarchy where we can say, if you've selected more than 2 radiography tests, you can show a radiation warning just to prompt the clinician that that's something just to be aware of. It doesn't stop anyone doing it, but you can filter in those advice points. Here's the bit where after this one you can scan a code will pop up again. So in this example, we've got a patient turned up and we'll go through the whole process here where they search for some clinical notes, and we're going to say they're on a diabetic, can't remember what we do. Diabetic diet. Yep. And they're going to get a fasting lipid, HbA1c, and we'll do a fasting glucose as well. And I think we'll go and put a pregnancy status before it moves on. Yep. And this is it's been submitted to the server now, so this request has been submitted, and then this barcode pops up. So in practice, the user might have that barcode sent to their phone, but here, if you've got the app, you can scan that, and you'll get a view of the patient app. It's just a read-only view of the request, but you'll see in it, there is a patient instruction too about fasting. We didn't put that on here, but there is some logic that says, if you select any sort of fasting test, you should include a fasting instruction for the patient as well. And then this other one. So let's say the patient now, they've had their test and they come back a week later, or maybe they go to another doctor and that doctor's going to request something as well. Here, they're just going to search for a random glucose, and they're going to order another HbA1c, and you can see they get this warning. So because we've got a shared registry of all these requests, the app can go and look at the server and say, have they had a recent HbA1c? And there's a number of reasons here. You shouldn't be doing HbA1cs regularly. Not only do you not get paid for them, it's a marker that doesn't really change that quickly. It's a long-term marker, so you shouldn't be doing it more than every few months. There's a similar one here that does radiology. I'll skip through that because I think this is my last slide anyway. But you can order a couple of X-rays. So this patient's going to get a left wrist X-ray and a CT of the wrist, left wrist, and they'll submit that to the server. But then they come back a week later and they might ask to do another X-ray, and the server can go and check and say, well, they've already had 2 X-rays this week, and it gives them a warning there. So they get a similar warning to before, but they've only done 1. Oh, and finally, I can skip through it. This is similar to what we showed before, all this leveraging of, this is our dashboard view, and just showing that you can do all these filters, even on a dashboard. You can filter by categories, modalities, and that's the last slide, and modalities, and that will filter all these different tests. Stopped. And body site, all those sort of things, and that list will shrink and grow as you see. But there's links here at the end, so sorry that was a real whirlwind, but I got through it in like maybe 10 seconds to spare. But feel free to click on any of these links. We make everything we do openly available for people to look at, because I guess we want people using SNOMED well, and we want them to adopt these sort of practices and see how they can learn from it. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. I'm afraid Matt has been taking up the time, so we don't have enough time for questions. So I really encourage you to grab him in the hall or after this session and raise your questions to him. And thank you for an excellent presentation, Matt.
Yeah,
thank you
feel
very
free
much.
to reach out today,
Yeah.
tomorrow, or anytime.
You'll also find him in the CSIRO booth. So
Yes.
please do that. Thank you very much.